Greetings, fellow Who Gazers, and welcome back to Doctor Who Literature, the podcast taking you through the world of the target novelizations in publication order. My name is Jason, and I'm your host on this journey, this very long journey. As I am on vacation the last couple of weeks of August, this episode was recorded well before the release date. You should be hearing this episode no earlier than Sunday, August 28th, 2022. The episode was recorded quite a bit before that, so there will not be any breaking news this week. If anything happens while I am away, I will address it when I get back, starting with next week's planned episode, episode 41. We do have some listener email. Dear Jason, thank you for generating weekly content with the Doctor Who Literature podcast. While I enjoy your interviews and monologues and streams of consciousness and trivia games, streams of consciousness. Well, I didn't set out to do that, but, this podcast kind of takes on a life of its own, and I will sometimes go off on riffs. So I'm glad you're enjoying them. Back to the email. This email is not about any of those things. No. What I want to ask you is this. How come your logo doesn't match the podcast name? Regards, Jack in Wisconsin. Thank you, Jack in Wisconsin. That's a very good question about the logo. I had originally intended to call this podcast The History of Doctor Who Literature, and I designed the logo to match that. In the week in between my original 5-minute trailer, which you can still find at the very bottom of my history on Anchor, and episode 1, I decided that History of Doctor Who Literature was a little too close to the History of Literature podcast, which, if you listen to the trailer, was a major inspiration for this show. But there is a difference between tribute and copyright infringement, so to speak. So after I designed the logo, I decided to shorten and simplify the name of the podcast. I think Doctor Who Literature covers it a lot better. I have not gone back to redesign the logo. Graphic design is not my strong point. I will circle back around to that for now, but as you notice, there is a disconnect between the logo and the podcast name, but no, we are just Doctor Who Literature. Thanks very much, Jack. Appreciate the email, and hope you keep listening. The novelization of the first televised story of the Graham Williams era, and thus the official premiere of Season 15, and the controversial, and in my opinion, underlooked and overrated Williams era. Even if not the first episode produced by Williams, the book version of Horror of Fang Rock came out just 6 months after the episode/season premiere itself. In fact, the publication date for the book listed online, March 30th, 1978, was less than 3 weeks after the air date of the season 15 finale, part 6 of The Invasion of Time. This book was perhaps not a stretch for Terence to adapt. It's his own story, his own TV scripts. And if the book only runs 120 pages, which is down 20 pages from his 1977 highs of The Claws of Axos and The Dalek Invasion of Earth and The Talons of Weng Chiang, well, this book hit the shelves really fast. Though, not fast for me. This was actually one of the final Target novelizations I bought of the original run. I bought it at a convention in 1996, more than a decade after I got my first 3 books on Super Bowl Sunday, 1985. Horror of Fang Rock as a TV serial is best remembered for circumstances having nothing to do with its plot, characters, or settings. It's best remembered, at least in the United States, for being interrupted by a pirate broadcast from a Max Headroom cosplayer in Chicago, which mimicked an incident in an early book in the line of V adaptations. In that V book, there is a pirate broadcast which also interrupts a Doctor Who episode, which is strongly reminiscent of Horror of Fang Rock. It was actually tempting to me when I was drawing up the script for this episode to actually play the Chicago pirate broadcast in the middle of my recording, but that really would take away from the point of this episode, which is that I love Horror of Fang Rock, and I think the episode is a lot more interesting than the fact that it keeps getting interrupted by pirate broadcasts, fictional or otherwise. So, without further ado, we're going to talk about how awesome is Horror of Fang Rock, and we're going to spend a lot of time talking. Coming up after the break, my interview with Steve Alexander. Let's get to it. Joining me on Doctor Who Literature for the very first time this week is a member of the Ham Fam, the expanded Joe Ford podcast universe, and a frequent guest panelist on Trap One, Steve Alexander. Steve, welcome to the show.
Hello, Jason. Thank you for having me on. It's a pleasure to be here.
So you and I have been on a few Trap Ones together. I think the last one that we did would have been last year. I think it was either the toys for Keys of Marinus or Sensorites. Do you recall which one it was?
I'm pretty sure it was the Sensorites, and the Sensorites was re-released more recently to tie in with with one of the Sensorites releases. So it probably was the Sensorites, yeah.
I have an unhealthy love of that story. So much of that episode was me talking in grand philosophical terms about it. This is one of Doctor Who's smartest stories ever. So, yeah, I have been accused of overdoing it on that one, but I think it is an underrated story for sure. Always happy to talk about Sensorites.
Yes, it's definitely. I think it's a classic, but of its time, and possibly it's been noted before, but it does. Of all the Doctor Who stories, it does feel the most 1950s Flash Gordon in style, which makes it unique in itself. So yeah, so it's worth it for that, definitely.
Of course, we're not here to talk about the Sensorites this week, although the running gag is that I always find a way to work in an insult about the Dominators in this podcast, so we'll consider this our obligatory Dominators bashing, unless it comes up organically later on during the recording.
Okay. I think yes. I'll see if I can work it in there. But I do quite enjoy the Dominators, so I'm one of those people.
Oh my goodness! So I will definitely try to steer clear of more insults about how overlong and boring and poorly written the Dominators is.
Yes, please do for my sake.
So, what is the last episode that you covered on Joe Ford's Hamster with a Blunt Penknife?
Well, it was going to be Praxeus, but that's been a little delayed. So we're doing that next week, which is going to be interesting.
Oh, wow.
Prior to that, my mind has gone completely blank. I know we've done The Green Death, which I thoroughly enjoyed. Dark Water, Death in Heaven, which was fun because it's controversial. We've done Survival, which was my very first commentary podcast, which was excellent. Oh, and we did the most recent one was Eccleston with The End of the World, which was fabulous. What a great story.
Oh, I have a real fondness for that one. That was the first time that I watched a Doctor Who episode in decades without knowing how it was going to end, because Rose I had already seen via a leak. And with the classic stories, I've been watching them over and over and over again. So you finally have, with the second episode of the new series, I was legitimately on the edge of my seat. The scene where Rose is stuck in the room and the sun shield is raising and she's about to get vaporized. I was legitimately, clinging to the edge of the bed there. That was, you'll never be able to duplicate that experience again watching End of the World for the first time, but it was one of the most fun times that I've ever had watching a brand new Doctor Who go out, for sure.
Oh yeah, and even watching it now, the 2005 series is quite out there. It still feels different and fresh in a way that perhaps we've got more used to Doctor Who now. There's a lot of things in that the style and the tone are very different to the way it's become. And to watch that at the time, it was so exciting. It was just thrilling. So yeah, I totally agree on that one.
And then, of course, Praxeus. I remember enjoying that one slightly more than Orphan 55. I thought it was an odd choice to have two very similar episodes so close in time in the same season.
Now that's they seem similar in tone. I think they were both shot overseas, weren't they?
Right.
In South Africa. Oh no, yeah, it was South Africa. Oh, I can't remember. Anyway, they were both shot overseas, so they've both got that sort of overbright, saturated feel. But Praxeus, I think, yeah, it's got a similar kind of energy, but I think it is a very different story, and it does a lot of interesting things. So I'm looking forward to having a chat about that one.
In terms of the environmentalism themes, what's neat about Praxeus is that the episode dropped, I think, the very first COVID-related death in the UK happened the same day that episode about a mankind-ending plague is aired, and of course, COVID just got worse and worse and worse, and we didn't have Doctor Who to save us in a convenient 45-minute episode package.
Yeah, I think if it had been, say, 6 months later, it would have been a much different and a much more difficult watch when everyone was in lockdown. I think it would have been unpleasant. But when it was just like new and nobody knew what was going to happen, I think that probably made it a bit more tolerable.
Right, and I think you're right. I think Praxeus. I've been calling it mentally Praxius in my head, but I think your pronunciation is more on point. I'm giving it the American gloss. That was South Africa, and Orphan 55, which is much more strident in messaging, is I think the Canary Islands.
Oh, okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. Sunny places anyway, so very nice.
Yeah, what's neat about the Canary Islands is you can do both the beach and you can do the mountain slash volcanic ash, which Planet of Fire had previously done, and Orphan 55 has a similar breakdown between using it as a beach location and a desolate end of the earth post apocalyptic wasteland.
Yeah, yeah, no, yeah, it does have that mix, doesn't it? Because they step outside the force field and it's a different world. So yeah, so that's really cool. Yep.
And yet it was all shot on the same island, which is pretty neat to production design and location scouting, definitely.
Yeah.
How long have you been a Doctor Who fan, Steve?
How long have I been a Doctor Who fan? It depends how long ago 1988 was. So I started okay. So my first awareness of Doctor Who, that my mother tells me, is my mum used to watch Doctor Who at home, and I used to sort of like as a very young child watch it. And the time she had to stop watching Doctor Who was a story where there were these monsters coming out of the swamp in the mist, and I was absolutely terrified. If you can, I believe that story was. Well, what do you think that story is?
You are describing almost shot for shot a very key scene in Orphan 55. However, it's unlikely that in 1988 that was your first story, so I'm
Oh
going to go
no!
with my backup choice and say Full Circle, which was a small visual inspiration on Orphan 55.
Yes, exactly. I think that's the one. I also have bizarre memories from a very long time ago at a school friend of mine's, Paul Giles's, probably his fifth or sixth birthday. Uh, there was something on the telly, and I wasn't sure what it was, and it seemed to be a bunch of old men running around a garden. And at various times, they get kidnapped by this big black triangle. And then suddenly, my worst terror appeared, which was a Dalek, and then it exploded, and there were guts going everywhere, and I couldn't take it anymore, and I probably had to go and have a lie down. But yes, so that story was obviously.
See, what you're doing here, Steve, is very clever because you know that at the end of almost every one of my interviews, I make my guest play a game of either guess that cliffhanger or a game of 20 questions. You are turning the tables on me and you're making me guess the episode. That's my job. I'll be the one asking the questions.
I reckon I'm going to fail 20 questions. I know I am after this.
No, no, no. You had me at old men running around gardens, so we are talking most definitely about the Five Doctors.
Yes, which that's just how it seemed to me as a kid, and watching it like years, sort of 5 or 6 years later on VHS, those old men running around the garden is so exciting. But when you don't know who any of them are, it's just all, yeah, that's just what it is. So yeah, so that was how I got that was my earliest memories, and then because I was interested in science fiction and Star Wars and Transformers, Doctor Who seemed like something I should like, but I was always too scared to watch. And it was round about the time Sylvester McCoy was announced that I thought, actually, now that it's got Sylvester McCoy in it, it won't be so utterly terrifying anymore. And I started tuning in towards the end of season 24. And I watched the first episode of Delta and the Bannermen, missed the next two, and then watched whole of Dragonfire. And I've watched pretty much every episode live ever since.
Oh, wow, that's pretty impressive. I know, obviously, with me here in the States, we were not getting the 1980 episodes live. We would always get them on some sort of delay. So, my very first episodes, Time Flight and Arc of Infinity, I would have been seeing Oh, probably about 1 to 2 years after their original broadcast. Caves of Androzani I saw about 10 months after, because that started here in January '85 after being broadcast in March '84. That was about as good as it got for me watching an episode almost in real time until the end of the world.
Hmm. So
So
did you have like pre knowledge? Were there magazines or anything that told you what was happening in advance? Because over in the UK, particularly with Star Trek, which we got on delay, you could pick up Starburst magazine. There'd be a synopsis, and you'd read, "Oh my word, what's going to happen in Next Generation? What's coming up?" Did you have something similar in the US?
it really depends on what level of fandom you were at. We had a recurring Doctor Who convention in New York City. Creation Convention had a Doctor Who con that would come to New York maybe 2 or 3 times a year. So the first time they had a con during my awareness of the show would have been probably March '85. I did not get to go, but one of my two friends who got me into the show in the first place was there, and they screened the first two stories of season 22. So he came back telling me about Attack of the Cybermen and Vengeance on Varos. Other than that, you would have needed to know somebody in a fan club, or you would have needed to know that Doctor Who magazine existed. I did not. I was discovering the show kind of in a vacuum, and my parents were confused as to why I was watching this weird British import rather than watching the shows that all my friends watched that might have made me less socially awkward. So it was a while. In the mid, probably in mid to late 1985, a brand new comic shop opened the next town over from me in the same strip mall where we had dinner at the same kosher deli every weekend. So I ran into that comic store even before we got to our table in the restaurant, and that was when I discovered the Marvel US comic, which ran for about 2 years, and it finally got pulled after 23 issues. But I bought like issues 20, 21, and 22 all on the same day, and that was a reprint of the DWM comics, but it also had the text columns from local people and letters to the editor. So it was a proper Marvel comic importing the DWM material. So I read the Stockbridge Horror in my very first issue, and in one of those issues, the news column said season 23 is going to be 14 episodes long, and the last two episodes are going to be a story called Gallifrey. And that's what ended up becoming the ultimate foe. So the very first bit of new, cutting edge, spur of the moment Doctor Who news ended up being wrong.
Yeah, there's no no news like wrong news, is there? You had fake news before anyone else. I don't know.
And that was about a decade before Fox News launched and poisoned the minds of a lot of older people that I know. And then my PBS station, they would do pledge breaks 3 or 4 times a year.
Yeah.
So they would break off an episode for 10 minutes, and one of the hosts who had other programs on the channel would talk to you about the importance of giving your money so they can keep paying for Doctor Who. And they would occasionally give snippets. So I remember in '87 or '88, at this point I was kind of drifting away from the show for the first time, and I wasn't reading the books as I bought them, and I wasn't really aware of anything that was happening after Series 22. So they mentioned that Mel had left the show, and this is before I even knew who Mel was. And they said she was being replaced by a character called the Ace. The Ace. I'm like, that's a terrible name for a character. Little did I know the crush that I would soon be developing on Sophie Aldred. So I would get these confused snippets of information. Like I found out about Patrick Troughton passing away about 6 months after that happened. It was a very interesting time and way to be a fan. Almost like, living in a foreign country and only getting odd bits of news by message in a bottle or by a sailor wandering around port telling you a story that happened on another continent 2 years ago. That's how I got. That's how I got into the show. It's a little better now.
Yeah, but that's in a way that's so great when it's rare, when it's difficult to get a hold of. That makes it more exciting. And I love that you found out that Mel was leaving before she arrived, because that just echoes that last speech that the Seventh Doctor gives to her about her never having been or not having arrived yet or whatever. So I think that's quite cool as well.
You're right. Actually, I feel better about that now because the way that I discovered her is the same way that she entered the series. She entered the series out of sequence, and you saw her departure before you ever saw her joining up. Her joining story didn't happen until the late 1990s when Gary Russell put it in a novel.
Yes, long overdue. Very good. Cool. Yeah. So after that, I was pretty much a fan, and I started picking up the novels straight away. My very first novel was The Seeds of. Let me get this right. The Seeds of the Troughton one. The Seeds of Death with
Correct.
the Ice Warriors. So I see. I'm dreading 20 questions. I can't remember which seeds it is. Um, but yeah, but that was my first one, and I was drawn in mainly by the cover, which was one of the most fantastic.
That is one of the best. That is the Ice Warrior silhouetted against the moon, silhouetted against a planet in the background, I think.
Yeah,
Doing that
that's
from
right.
memory. It
Yeah,
is a gorgeous, very complex cover design.
yeah, but also strong and striking because the Ice Warrior is most of the cover.
Right.
Um, and then it was just they were a joy and so easy to read. Well, I found them easy. They are easy to read, aren't they? There's one or two which stretch you a bit, but most of them they're suitable for pretty much any age. Um,
There's a couple of authors who had written for the show in the 60s who were hired back 20 years later to novelize their one and only one television serial. Some of those authors had a problem with run on sentences. So some of those mid 80s books, although well intentioned and although adding value and moments to their original story, could be a little challenging to read prose wise, which is never a problem that you're going to get with Terrence Dicks. And the question of whether or not Terrence wrote too many of the books is an issue we're still debating, several years after he passed away, because you have David Fisher obviously rewrote the novelizations of his first two stories, and those are now available commercially for the first time. But I can't imagine anybody doing a better job with Seeds of Death than Terrence did. Brian Hales, of course, was already passed away at that point, but looking at some of the problems that Brian Hales had with adjectives and overly saturated paragraphs in the Curse of Peladon novelization. I think, and since Terrence wrote most of Seeds of Death in Brian Hales' absence anyway, I think Terrence was the best choice to novelize that story.
yes, yes, he and I think his what he does, which is so brilliant, and it's more of a skill than anything else, is making it accessible and making it so that people can enjoy the story with the minimal of extra kind of fluff. I It's this kind of thing. It is an art in a way, but it's also a skill. I don't want to say he's not an artist. He's not creative, but he takes the basic elements of the story and he builds exactly the right amount to make it enjoyable and to move it along. And I think that's again, there are other ones where some of the early ones where it expands more, which are very interesting, and some of the later ones where he's sort of getting back into it. But the ones in the middle, the great bulk of the ones that filled my local Croxley Green Library,
Huh.
um, which were were always a pleasure, were the ones where you felt closest to the story simply because of the simplicity and yeah, the sheer skill of the writing. I think that's what is so impressive about the man. Yeah,
And we're talking about Horror of Fang Rock today, which, similar to Seeds of Death, this is Terrence novelizing a story that he himself wrote for the screen. Although Seeds of Death, he was doing a rewrite on the back three episodes. Horror of Fang Rock is his from start to finish. You could argue this book could benefit from an extra 10 or 20 pages, give us a little more historical background. It is we're not quite at the era where he's doing 95-page books, but this is kind of on the bare bones side. It's only 120 pages start to finish. You could argue that if he had written this later on, when he was back to doing 140-page novelizations, he could have given it some more detail. But I know we're jumping the gun by talking about the last sentence first. I can't imagine any writer who could do a last paragraph of a book, this book, better than Terrence could. I mean, the last sentence, no one was left alive to hear them. How could you possibly improve on that? Name one author who could do a better sentence than that. I don't think it's possible.
exactly what it's 7 or 8 words, and just coming at the end, the build up to it. So you get they're speculating about the fate of the island now that everyone's gone and that everyone's dead, and what are people going to think when they find this place. And he reads the bit from the Ballad of Flannan Isle, which was the sort of obvious inspiration for the story, and it all just and then you have the TARDIS disappearing with the wheezing and groaning sound. It's it's so well constructed, and then just leaves you with that little thing to take away at the end. And with the Terrance Dicks novels as well, it's always like that's the end of that. That's the end of that chapter. But there's the feeling that we're now moving on to the next adventure. It's time to pick up the next book, which is as much a sales technique as anything. But
Of course.
yeah, no, I totally agree. It's very impressive.
It's funny about the Ballad of Flannan Isle. Wilfred Gibson was not a well-known poet here in the States. And this is, of course, I'm in the 1980s and I don't have access to the internet. I had no way of finding the original of that poem. And for a couple of years, I thought it was made up. I didn't realize it was a real thing. One of the first things when I got to university, or as we say here, college, one of the first things I did was go to my college library, and I was able to find a musty old, century old bound volume of Wilfred Gibson poems. And I found that book in the stacks in the lower levels of the library. And I photocopied out the actual Flannan Isle poem. Now, of course, you can Google that in 20 seconds. But I was carrying around a photocopied version of that for years, and I was proud of it. Proud of proving this poem was a real thing, and Terrence didn't make it up. And it's actually a really good poem. And the last lines of that poem are, in their way, just as powerful as the last lines of the TV story. From memory, I think the last two lines of the poem are three men alive on Flannan Isle who thought on three men dead, which is incredible. And now,
Yeah,
of course, I'm
wow.
going to the actual poem on Google, and let's see if I got it right.
I hope so. You had
Yes.
it
Oh, I got it.
well
I got it
enough.
right, word for word. Wow. Go, Jason.
Ah, there we go. You not only had the photocopy, you also looked at it and memorized it properly.
Yeah. So Terrence is the man to write this story, and he is the man to novelize it. And in case I have not carefully laid all my cards on the table, this is it. This is one of my top 10. This is one of my favorite Doctor Who stories of all time. Even though it's downbeat, even though, of course, it's got a bit of a nihilistic ending, I can watch this over and over again without ever getting tired of it. For me, this is almost perfection, and it's one of Terrence's finest hours. So, on a scale of 1 to Horror of Fang Rock, Steve, how much do you like Horror of Fang Rock?
Well, I'm afraid I okay. I have some issues with Horror of Fang Rock, which are probably not. I will grant you, it is tremendously atmospheric. It is. You've got it if you're watching it on a cold day in November, and it's crisp outside, and the evening's drawing in. It is a perfect bit of television. But my issues come from the. So you start off with the original three characters. You got Vince, Ben, and Ruben, and then they're sort of like variously killed off or impersonated at different times. And then you have the great big crash at the end of episode one that brings in how many extra characters? Four extra characters. You've got Adelaide. Who else?
Adelaide, the Colonel, Lord Palmerdale, and Harker, which takes the story back to its Dracula roots, as I'll get into more detail later on in the program.
Yeah, yeah. So it's for me, it's the middle two episodes where I think the plot is a bit. I feel the plot's a little bit muddled, and it's a little bit. I'm not really sure what's going on. They're running around. They're going upstairs, downstairs, they're keeping the boiler pressure up, and it doesn't follow a solid straight line like some Doctor Who stories because the Rutan becomes. Sorry, spoilers. It's a Rutan. The
Wait,
Rutan
what?
becomes this.
You're kidding me. No. I would never have guessed.
Apparently, Doctor Who fans know it's a Rutan. The horror Fang Rock, the beast thing, kind of slips into the background, and you get an interesting but separate storyline about Lord Palmerdale wanting to phone the mainland and talk, and get his deal through and sort out his business with his diamond trading. Um, and I just feel that at that point, it just like I don't know, it treads water a little bit, which is being very pernickety in a way. But I again, it's one that I love to watch. I enjoy it thoroughly. But when I think back what happens in it, maybe I haven't watched it enough times. When I think back about what the story is, it kind of goes near for the middle bit. I don't know. Can tell me I'm wrong. Please tell me I'm wrong.
You're 1,000% wrong, and I'm going to vehemently disagree with you in my best Joe Ford style for the next 20 minutes as the episode plays forgotten in the background of our argument, which describes every episode of Hamster with a blunt penknife that I did back in the day. So, have you ever seen the movie The Vanishing with Gerard Butler, which is about 3 or 4 years old at this point? Because that is a straight retelling of the Flannan Isle story without monsters and without science fiction. Have you seen it?
I have not. Who's in The Vanishing? Who are the
Gerard
actors?
Butler is the lead,
Okay.
and the other two actors are Peter Mullen and Connor Swindells, who, as an American, I have to say I am not as familiar with. Heard of Gerard Butler, had not heard of the other two. And one plays an older man. He plays the Reuben of the story. And the other one plays the younger, more idealistic keeper. He plays the Vince of the story.
Okay. Yes. No, I've not seen it, and it's one that on your recommendation I might check out. But yeah. So how is that related to Fang Rock?
Well, it's the same base story. It's the three lighthouse keepers on Flannan Isle, and it explains exactly why they disappeared. And there's a little bit of a mashup with the plot of the movie A Simple Plan, okay? Because we know that there were three men alive on Flannan Isle in the year 1900. We know they disappeared. We know they never resurfaced, so we can assume they all died on the island. What the movie The Vanishing does is try and explain why, and it has a fictitious story overlaid onto the fates of the lighthouse keepers, and it speculates what could have happened to these three men. So there is sort of like horror of Fang Rock. There is another boat, and there is a secondary cast of characters who shows up maybe in the second reel, and they create a moral slash ethical dilemma. And from that point on, the movie gets very, very violent, not in a graphic horror sense. So there's no Rutan, there's no lycanthropy, there's no. And I assume that when Tom Baker said chameleon factor, he was mispronouncing the word. There's no chameleon factor. We would say chameleon here. And then, of course, I'm not going to spoil the ending, but something happens, and the lighthouse keepers have to wrestle with what has gone on, and they all react to it in very different ways, and this ties into their ultimate fates, how they die and slash or disappear. It is dark, it is moody, it's gorgeous to look at, and it's very, very violent in terms of fist fights and how what one man does to another man when they're fighting at close quarters, fist to fist. It's, however, a little bit slow moving, especially the first reel, which is just setting up the workday lighthouse routine. And there's long, silent montages of these guys going about their business before the complicating factor happens in the second reel. What I think Horror of Fang Rock does better than The Vanishing, if it was just a story about the Beast of Fang Rock, and if it was just a story about an alien presence picking off the characters one by one, then we're just back to episodes 3 and 4 of Planet of Evil. And you're just waiting for the next one to die, waiting for the next one to die. I think what Terrence does very cleverly is he has a political overlay, and he has these characters show up who already have a history that we learn about bit by bit. And you have the Colonel, who's a member of Parliament, and you have Lord Palmerdale, who has this tremendous scandal, and then you have Lord Palmerdale's mistress, who is an utterly useless character because she is a high society lady dressed in a gown, and she is not equipped, number one, for a night alone on a lighthouse, and is not equipped to deal with a horror from beyond the stars. How each of these characters makes the situation worse is the best part of Horror of Fang Rock for me. So while part one is really good, and while the actor who plays Ben, Ralph Watson, who's he did a lot to promote Doctor Who over the years because he was on the show 3 or 4 times. He's a lot of fun to watch when he's there, and I think Colin Douglas is terrific as both Ruben and the Rutan. But if you don't have these characters show up in part two and present this complication, I think the story suffers as a result. I don't think it's as good of a story if that yacht doesn't show up.
Yes, I do agree with that, and I am probably being monstrously unfair towards Horror Fang Rock.
Rutan
So there
level
we go.
unfair.
Root and level unfair, indeed. Yes, and I am happy to be talked into enjoying something more, because that way I win as well. Um, what one thing, because I was thinking, while I was going through it this time, I was thinking also it reminded me of something else I'd read a short while back, and the way the characters are played around with, and the way they're slowly picked off. It's not exactly, but actually, it reminded me of and then the Agatha Christie novel, And Then There Were None, because that has a bunch of people in a confined space who are slowly done away with. And I think it's got that kind of feel to it. It's got that kind of how is this character going to get bumped off? What's going to happen to this guy? There's no point where it says that definitely everybody's going to is it implied that everyone's going to die? Possibly from the sort of legend of the horror of Fang Rock, from what happened previously on the island.
So let's
Yeah.
go behind the scenes then and talk about that. This is a story that you can get off the DVD. Not everybody was supposed to die in this story. As Terrence originally scripted it, the Colonel survives and Adelaide survives because Terrence was not really keen about killing off a woman on camera. He then delivers his scripts, comes back to the office a week later, and Robert Holmes is smirking at him. And I'm using a little bit of creative license here. I don't know how it happened, but I can imagine they're face to face. Terrence Dix is the OG, the gangster, the Godfather, the guy who did more Doctor Who than anybody in the early 70s. His first script for the story gets tossed because you couldn't do a Dracula story at that particular moment on the BBC because it would have competed with one of their more prestige serials. So he has to write this story. He didn't want to write a Lighthouse story. That was Robert Holmes's idea. So now he's writing a story he doesn't want to tell. And then he tells a nice, happy story where two characters get to survive the horror. And there's Bob Holmes smirking at him saying, "You can't do this." And Terrence is going, "I'm Terrence Dix. I can do whatever I want. Don't you know who I am?" And then Robert Holmes says to him, again, this is a little bit of creative license, "You can't tell a story on Flannan Isle where people survive because that isn't what happened." So then Terrence goes back and he kills off Adelaide and he kills off the Colonel. I think Alan Rowe gives one of my favorite guest performance turns in Doctor Who because here he's very natural and he's very sympathetic. Yes, he's a compromised politician, but he's doing the best he can to clear his good name and act honorably. The way that he dies haunted me when I was 11 or 12 years old when I first saw it because Doctor Who stories usually pass moral judgments on their characters, right? You can usually tell in the classic series who's going to survive and who's going to die based on how they behave. At any other time, the Colonel has earned his right to survive this story because he is a steadfast ally of the Doctor. He's the first one who realizes the Doctor is right and there is a horrible raving beast from beyond the stars and I'm going to help him. He then goes back to collect the diamonds because, well, the book goes into it in more detail, and that's what gets him killed. And then the Doctor lies to Leela about his death to make him seem more heroic than he actually was. That's really, really good storytelling, and it's a really good drama. And you credit both Robert Holmes for ordering Terrence to kill off the Colonel, and you credit Terrence for the way that he did it. I think it's one of the reasons why I watch it, not because of the lighthouse, not because of the Rutan. I think the way the characters interact in the story is one of the selling points for me. Now, tell me that I'm wrong.
No, I won't. You're entirely right. It is, and again, the performances and the claustrophobia of the lighthouse setting really helps sell it. And for it to be character led, it has to be for this kind of story because the root and screen time is absolutely minimal. for when you see it, fairly obvious reasons. So,
I don't know what you're talking about.
well, everyone loves a green blob. But yeah, yes, and so based on what you said there as well, obviously the real killer of Fang Rock was Robert Holmes, who wiped out two members of the cast who would otherwise have survived. Um, yeah, no, I think well, I've got a confession to make, which I'm going to
Uh-oh.
have to make at some point. I did not read my copy of the Horror of Fang Rock prior to coming here tonight, um, which
That's
is
an
I don't
interesting confession. You came to discuss a book and you didn't read the book.
know. I had Louise Jameson read it to me via the.
What? Oh, you had Louise Jameson came to your home and said, "Are you sitting comfortably?" And then I'll begin, and read you the book. Where can
More
I get that? Where can I get Louise Jameson coming to my home and tucking me in and reading me a bedtime story?
Well, you'd be pleased to know that Louise Jameson is freely available to read at any time via the miracle of the Doctor Who Target novel talking book CD range, um, which is okay. So Louise Jameson's reading of the Horror of Fang Rock is absolutely wonderful. She doesn't do anything particularly different or special. She's just really, really good at it, and it just brings everything to life in a way, and in a slightly different way to the TV version. So you've got a slightly different emphasis. She can do the voices. She can do because Tom Baker obviously has got a strong, deep, masculine voice, but she does something slightly different with it. She takes it in a slightly different direction, and it's a real pleasure to hear. So yeah, I thoroughly enjoy all of the pretty much all of the CD range that I've heard. And Louise Jameson, excellent, is one of the best readers, one of the many best readers actually, because there's so many.
See, we have not talked a lot about the audiobook novelizations on this show, and that is my fault. It's my show. I should talk about them more. When Pete Lambert was on to discuss Doctor Who and the Cybermen, the novelization of the Moonbase, he, I believe, listened to the Annika Wills CDs before coming on. And when Ross Aitken from Gallifrey's Most Wanted was here to discuss Curse of Peladon, he and I had a very different take on the book. I was more critical of the prose because I was reading it, but he was much more complimentary of the prose because he was hearing it. He was listening to David Troughton read the book. So he and I had very different experiences based on how we chose to experience the novelization. I will say that I didn't know that the audio CDs existed. The way that I discovered them was when I got my copy of the Doctor Who and the Silurians DVD, probably in 2008, living in California. Carolyn John was one of the voices in the audio commentary booth. And she mentions casually that she recorded the novelization audiobook. And I didn't know that was a thing. Stopped the DVD, ran to the other room where my computer was, jumped on. It was either Amazon or Audible. 2 weeks later, I had a copy of the CDs, and I'm driving around Southern California listening. I'm like, this is the greatest thing I've ever heard because you have music added on, you have sound effects, but not too much to drown out the story. And otherwise, it's just 3.5 hours of Carol and John reading to you one of the greatest Doctor Who books ever written. So I quickly became obsessed and I started collecting. Now, again, just in terms of economies of scale, I can't afford to buy every single one of these. So at this point, I haven't heard any in a while, and I'm choosing to read my way through this podcast rather than listen. But you have me intrigued now because Horror of Fang Rock, among many other things that I love about it, is one of the great voice stories. You have Tom Baker doing perhaps the greatest audio cliffhanger of all time at the end of part three. And I won't even, I'll drop in the audio clip at some point just to hear him say, I thought I locked the enemy out. Instead, I've locked it in with us. That is the greatest, or one of the greatest cliffhangers the show's ever done because it doesn't rely on a dated special effect. It's just Tom Baker and his eyes looking at the camera, delivering a really good line of dialogue in a very intense and frightening way. And then, of course, you have Colin Douglas as Ruben playing the grizzled old senior. Well, not he wasn't the keeper. The senior most man on the island with his regional accent. Louise Jameson has a lot of work cut out for her because the voice acting in the story has some incredible turns. How does she do with that Tom Baker cliffhanger moment, which in the book I suppose is the end of chapter 9? And how does she do with a character like Colin Douglas, who's playing two characters at once, one of which has a funny regional accent?
Yes, I mean, there is a bit of sort of well, she does a couple of regional accents. So you've got a bit of West Country for some of the characters. You've got a bit more sort of a Northern accent for some of the others. But it's difficult to describe, and I may find that I am dropping you an audio clip so you can do a direct comparison of the two, if you're happy to include that. Because I think that would be the best way to demonstrate what pleasure it is to hear Louise Jameson's take on all those. And I think actually, if we can have the two side by side and have the Tom Baker version of that cliffhanger and the Louise Jameson version, I think that would be fascinating for everyone. If that's okay with you.
I will play that as a bumper in between this interview and in between the second half of the program, which is my reading out my review of the novelization. So if you send me the Louise Jameson link, I will include them both a little bit later on in this episode.
Brilliant, brilliant. Yes, yeah. It's yes. There are. She does do voice. She does do a bit of voices. She does do accents, but they're scaled back and they're recognisably her voice. She doesn't overdo it. She doesn't go into full kind of territory. She doesn't go Pig Bin Josh, so to speak. Um,
Ah.
but she just it's like it's that difficult thing about acting, about just getting it right and pitching it at exactly the right level. And that is where somebody like Louise Jameson just has that skill. So yeah, that is what makes it a pleasure to listen to.
The audio novelizations benefit from having these Doctor Who regulars and frequent guest actors come and do so many of the readings. You've had Richard Franklin, you have had Carolyn John, who has since passed away, you have had Katie Manning, you have had Louise Jameson, you have had Jeffrey Beavers, you had Stephen Thorne, and Derek Jacobi that came in and did audio novelizations. There's probably no more fun job than being the producer of that range. And it's just wonderful that we have these. And again, it is faster to read the book than it is to listen. I don't often have 3.5 hours to listen to somebody slowly reading out a 120-page book, whereas I can read a 120-page book, in 20 minutes a night over 4 nights.
Yeah,
Much more efficient for me to just read. And then, of course, I get to look at my copies of the books too and see what pictures I drew in them 40 years ago that I forgot having drawn in the first place, which happened to me with the Deadly Ascent. I had totally forgotten that I drew a bad rendition of the TARDIS on the title page of Deadly Assassin. So it's fun for me to go back and revisit my copies, my physical copies of the books. But yeah, I
yes, no,
cannot recommend the audio range highly enough, and I'm glad that you've talked about them.
yeah. I mean, I will happily waffle on for at least another half hour about them if you'll let me. I know you can't draw while you are well, you could draw. You could sit and draw while listening to them, but they're ideal for, let's say, you've got a lot of decorating to do, or you're going on a car journey. And many of these audios that I've listened to, I've done them while I've been going to events or places or things. So suddenly the story and the reading of it gets linked into memories that I have from years ago. It's just all sort of like linked into places and things and times. And yeah, I know Doctor Who fans' listening space is taken up by podcasts and Big Finish, but the target novel readings are well worth a listen. There are some in particular, I think, with some of the ones that really benefit hugely are the missing stories and some of the early Hartnell and Troughtons. And there's a fair few where you could say that actually the target novel reading is the best version. That's the one that captures the most atmosphere. So I was in it right from the start. So I think it was probably a Christmas or birthday present that I got the 3 CD set, which had William Russell, came out in 2005, just when Doctor Who was getting exciting again. William Russell reading The Web Planet, The Daleks, or Doctor Who in an Exciting Adventure with the Daleks, and The Crusades.
Doctor Who and the Crusaders, yes.
And The Crusaders, yes, thank you. But what an absolutely it's such a great trilogy to choose to start the range with. Even though at the time it's probably just like, oh, we're just going to do these three. They didn't think they were going to. They've nearly done them all now. There's like 10 left to do. Um, but those three, just to hear William Russell reading those lines, it was a foggy night on Barnes Common, and the whole introduction to the whole different introduction to the exciting adventure with the Daleks is it's so wonderfully atmospheric and so well read. You do have an issue with the Dalek one that, and this is something that comes up again and again in a couple of ways, that William Russell has to do the Dalek voices, which,
Right.
and you think all of the different actors, you've got Daleks and you've got Cybermen, and you think all the different actors who are going to be doing this are going to have a different take on it and do it in different ways. John Pertwee, a very long time ago, before it started, read an abridged version of, I believe it was Planet of the Daleks.
Uh, I know that I have somewhere a copy of an abridged version of The Curse of Pellet, a novelization
Yes.
read by John Pertwee, and an abridged version of the State of Decay, narrated by Tom Baker. Those are the ones that I remember.
Yeah, yeah. I just remember, because I don't think I've heard those abridged versions, but I just remember someone saying that John Pertwee doing Dalek voices was particularly bizarre, and that you'd never know what you're going to get. But they kind of fixed that in a way, because now it's always, if it's a Dalek story or a Cyberman story, it's always the reader and Nicholas Briggs. So Nicholas Briggs will fill in the Dalek voices, and that's fine.
For
Um,
example, the novelization of the two-parter of the Daleks' Master Plan, the books are read alternately by Peter Purvis and Gene Marsh, but Nick Briggs is there whenever a Dalek is speaking. That's another great oral, AURAL, experience. Um, yeah, the other point that I'll make is some years ago I wrote a review of the novelization of The King's Demons, which is not coming up on this show for about 2 years, so I don't mind talking about it now. That's another one. Terence Dudley wrote the TV episode and he wrote the book himself rather than having Terence do it in the mid to late 80s. And Terence Dudley really goes to town with long run on sentences and archaic words. And I could not imagine anybody being able to read that book as an audio because there are so many run on sentences that go on for days. And I couldn't imagine even the most skilled actor with the best breath control being to read that entire sentence in one take. And at the time that I wrote my review, this is probably 2013, they had not yet released King's Demons as an audiobook, and I was willing to bet it was because the prose was so unworkable. But they eventually got to it, and they got Mark Strickson to do it, and by gum, he made it work.
I have to say that is, I've heard most of them. I have not yet made myself listen to the King's Demons, but I will. The other two, I believe the other two Terence Dudley novelizations, you've got Black Orchid, haven't you?
Yes.
And you've got K9 and Company.
I did not know that K9 Company was out as an audiobook. I'm pretty sure that Michael Cochran, who was both in Black Orchid and Ghostlight, did the audiobook for Black Orchid, if memory serves me right, but I haven't heard it.
Yeah, Black Orchid is okay. So there are very few duds in the range. I've just listed two of them, and they have one thing in common, which is they're written by Terence Dudley. Um, Black Orchid. Michael Cochran struggles with Black Orchid, and which is strange because Michael Cochran is brilliant, and they get him back and they give him the War Machines later to just to make up for it, so he can
Oh,
have a
wow,
good
I
one
didn't
to
know that.
read.
That's
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah. Um, I am of the opinion that K9 and Company is the worst novel in the English language. Um, I don't know. You don't have to agree with that or disagree with that. That's just my opinion. But it is. It was appalling. John Leeson reads it, and he's game. He does a good job. And of course, John Leeson not only does that, he also reads all of the K9 segments in all of the novels. So you always get a K9 co-credit whenever John Leeson co-credit whenever K9's on, which is wonderful as well. But yeah, that is a bit of a dud. while I'm on the subject, then the other ones that kind of failed were there's the Gunfighters, which I think is a good novel. Do you have strong memories of the Gunfighters?
I'm just going to circle back for a moment, and I'm going to
Okay.
say that I don't think Canine and Company can be considered the worst novel ever written when it comes as part of the same range as Turlo and the Earthlink Dilemma.
Ah,
We can
the
revisit that in a couple of years when those come up on the show.
the only reason I do not agree with you is because I've not read Turlo and the Earthlink Dilemma. Um, I I I may do one day just to see if it challenges my views.
We'll see how far you can get. And
Yeah.
looping back around, what was the
Yes.
specific question you had for me that was not about Turlo and the Earthlink Dilemma?
It was about the Gunfighters. Do you think
So
is that a good novel?
I love the Gunfighters as a TV story. I think
Hmm.
it's one of Doctor Who's best productions, and I realized that in the 1980s would have gotten me excommunicated from fandom, and even today as a minority opinion. I think the Gunfighters is very well written, and it's very funny, and I am a huge fan of Linda Barron and the ballad, especially in parts 3 and 4 when Rex Tucker starts writing the ballad himself, and it becomes very, very, very funny. Whereas earlier in the story, it was more descriptive. It becomes narrative and sarcastic. I love the Gunfighters. My issue with the novelization, and I love the fact that Donald Cotton included the ballad in the novelization. So mega props to that. Before sheet music, I was able to have the lyrics to the ballad because Donald Cotton puts them in the book. The problem is that the Gunfighters on TV is a very well, it's comedic in parts, but it gets very very dark in episode 4, and it's otherwise just a straight good dramatic retelling of a fictitious version of Gunfight at the OK Corral. The novelization turns the Gunfighters into a parody of a western. When you think about how Doc Holliday marries Katie, um, in the TV serial, it's because they're together. The version of it in the novelization is that he hired her on an hourly basis and then couldn't afford to pay her fee, so ended up marrying her to do the honorable thing. That sort of detail I don't think is very Doctor Who-ish, if you can boil Doctor Who down to an essence. And I think it turns the book from a good Western into a parody of a Western. So I wasn't crazy about that. And then Donald
Yeah.
Cotton goes a little overboard with the whole thing about carving Gaul into 4 pieces and then carving the character's gallbladder into 4 pieces. That's his idea of a joke. Uh, I
Hmm.
think the book could have used a more straightforward adaptation rather than turning it into a silly parody. It's entertaining, and I've read the book multiple times, and it has another great cover because it has that great illustration of Hartnell with outer space drawn into his black frock coat.
Oh yeah,
So
yeah. I
it's
love that.
it's an
Yeah.
interesting book and it's a great cover, but I don't think it is a great novelization of a TV story for which I have an inordinate amount of fondness.
Okay, so you won't be too disappointed to learn then that it made for an almost unlistenable couple of hours because they got so the person they got into it was Shane Rimmer. Shane Rimmer is known for for working on some of the Jerry Anderson series, and he's got a strong American accent. He can talk like you do, but the way he does it is he puts on this kind of like old Western drawl, and it just makes it so hard to listen to. It's so thick and unpleasant. It was a real letdown because knowing the actor and knowing that he's a skilled actor, it was like, oh, this is going to be a good one. But no, it wasn't. It wasn't very good at all. But anyway, I don't want to put people off the range. I want to tell you my 10 favourite standout audio readings, if you'll indulge me. Would that be okay?
Well, last week I indulged Jim Sangster with his top 10 target novelizations. I think the top 10 is a tremendous value addition to the show, so I'm glad that you are doing it uncoordinated with Jim. And that's actually 2 weeks ago. I'll say that Leland last week did not do a top 10 in the Face of Evil episode, but that's 2 out of 3 weeks with a top 10. So I'm very happy to hear yours. So from number 10
Excellent.
to number 1, have at it.
Okay. Again, top tens are very pejorative things. They change all the time. So these are just 10 great ones in a
Let's not
sort
say
of 10
let's say subjective rather than
subjective.
pejorative.
Yes, yes. Sorry, I get my good words mixed up. I stick to simple words. It works. Um, so one of the very best ones is The Curse of Fenric, which I think is also a great, great novelization. But you've got Terry Malloy reading it, and he is I slightly because he's not an A-list, he's not a very well-known actor, but my word, he brings out the absolute best in Curse of Fenric. It is a fantastic listen, and all the interesting stuff, all the different because it's one of those novels that's expanded so hugely, and there's so much extra mythology in there. And with Terry Malloy giving it everything, it's wonderful. It's a superb listen.
Oh wow.
So I definitely recommend that one. Um, and another standout one is The Mind Robber, read by Derek Jacobi. And like I just say that, how could it not be a standout novel? It is. Have you heard that one?
Yes, I mentioned it earlier in this hour, and I have that one, and I have listened to it. It's been over a decade since I heard it, but Derek Jacobi reading anything is automatically going to be a natural top 10. And
Oh yeah.
Mind Robber, the book, makes some very interesting narrative choices and adds some interesting jokes. Derek Jacobi is the perfect person to do it.
Oh yeah. And he does an A1 Patrick Troughton as well.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
and the other comment I'd have on that is that for about 2 weeks afterwards, after listening to it, Derek Jacobi had got into my head and he was narrating my internal dialogue. So all my thoughts were in Derek Jacobi's voice for couple of weeks afterwards, which was kind of bizarre, but very nice,
That
I'd
is a
say.
good problem to have.
It is. It is. He's got a great voice. So we've got two next, which are ones that are read by the authors. So the first one up is Logopolis, read by Christopher Bidmead, or Christopher H. Bidmead.
That is the only audiobook that I've listened to more than once. I will say it's my
Oh, yeah.
favorite.
Oh, wow. Yes, yes. I agree with you. I've spoken to Cy Hart. He would agree with you. It's a wonderful one. I'm just gonna sit here and say wonderful, wonderful a lot, but it's a great reading. He is again, we know he's done acting. We know he's got the experience, but it's one of these people you actually hear him reading a book, and the passion and the fact that it's his story comes across so brilliantly well, and you can overlook Tegan's accent. You can forgive him for doing that because that's just the way Tegan speaks. And it brings me on to another topic actually, which is there are a couple of characters in Doctor Who have very specific accents, and hearing other people have a go at them is always either hilarious or very impressive. So the main two are Tegan, obviously, Australian accent, very easy to do a thick, bad Australian accent. And the really difficult one is Sylvester McCoy.
Hmm.
Now, many of the people who go on the audiobooks and do Sylvester McCoy will actually do a kind of Scottish accent, or just a kind of. Rula Lenska does a thick Glaswegian accent for the Happiness Patrol.
Yes.
But Sylvester has a very unique accent, a very different way of talking, and it's not pure Scottish in that way. It's very I don't know if it's a regional thing or if it's because he's travelled a lot or because he doesn't necessarily live in Scotland anymore. But he's got his own way of talking, and it's so hard to get right. So yeah, it's just interesting to see how people tackle that. So next in my top 10, somebody who doesn't need to do the voices because his own voice is so lovely is Barry Letts reading The Demons.
Ooh, yes, yes, yes.
And if you
That's
haven't,
another very, very good one.
yeah, exactly. These are all ones. If you haven't heard any of the range, pick out one of these because I, Barry Letts has such a great tone, such a steady, strong way of reading that just draws you in. And hearing the author read their work and putting their emphasis in and reading it with their passion is always going to be a winner.
And I will say that, like Christopher H. Bidmead, Barry Letts was an actor first before getting onto the other side of the camera. So they are both natural choice is to read their own books because they know how to act and they know how to speak, and they're both excellent books. Logopolis is, spoiler alert, my favorite novelization of all time, and it'll be a long time before we get to it here, but I've already got my guests for the episode booked. I'm already very excited for that one a year out. And The Demons was one of my first novelizations. It was part of the second batch of books that I ever got, and that was my introduction to the Pertwee era. And I could not love The Demons more. The worst part about The Demons is that Barry Letts wrote several books after that one, and not one of them is half as good as The Demons ended up being.
But the Demons is it's, and you can tell it in his reading. It's the one he loves. He
Mm-hmm.
loves the characters. He loves the story, and that just comes across so well. Um, yeah. So moving on to my next one. So there's a couple where these are ones read by the companions, and a couple of these are no longer with us, and it's so nice to have them, to have this memory of them reading this book. So the first one is, I think you mentioned earlier, Caroline John. I went for my favourite one that I had of hers was the Auton Invasion. Simply because I think it's a slightly better novel. It's slightly more action packed. But Caroline John, again, yeah, just there is a difference in tone between sort of the male readers and the female readers, and that's natural and that's great, and it's great to have that texture and that difference. It I think it created a bit of a problem for the Daleks' master plan, because the way they split it up was they had one chapter with Peter Purves, and one chapter with Jean Marsh, and I don't think the balance between the two of them worked, because Peter has such a sort of loud, strident voice, and Jean Marsh is much more is more quiet and contained. And I think Jean's reading actually suffered because of it. And if they'd have split them up book by book and done one each, I think I'd have enjoyed them both more. But anyway, that's kind of beside the point.
Jean Marsh is one of the greatest actresses to ever get folded into the Doctor Who universe. So, like Derek Jacobi, having her do a novelization audiobook is a wonderful idea. And it's a wonderful thing that she was able to sign up to do some big finishes as well, in addition to her prolific regular body of work. So, it's difficult for me to hear criticism of Jean Marsh, and it's been over a decade since I heard that novelization on audio. I don't recall having the same reaction as you. For me, it was the simple endorphin rush of hearing Peter Purves tell me a great book, and the simple endorphin rush of hearing Jean Marsh tell me the other half of a great book, not to mention Nicholas Briggs doing his thing. I enjoyed the listening experience so much that I didn't have the same result as you. So I'll throw that one out to the audience. Is Jason right? Is this a great book just because of the names attached? Or is Steve right that the audio mix between these two performers could have been a little better done? I'll throw that out, and send us an email, Doctor Who Literature, drwholiterature at Gmail. We will read your email out on the air, and we will see who is correct, me or Steve.
I'm very interested. At the end of the day, if I have to come down to it, it's just Peter's louder. That's the main problem. Anyway, so yeah, back to the Auton Invasion. Yeah, it's one of the earlier ones. You've got Caroline John, and she's just got that kind of, again, a bit like Barry Letts, that just kind of tone, that storytelling tone, where from the very start, from the bit where she's reading about the changing face of Doctor Who, you're just settle down and listen. It draws you in. Also reading The Changing Face of Doctor Who was Liz Sladen doing Planet of the Spiders.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I need to say anything about this. It's Liz Sladen reading Planet of the Spiders. That should be enough to get anyone excited. That is,
You had me. You had me at Liz Sladen. Enough said.
any of the ones she reads are well, and she only did Planet of the Spiders in the end, I think, which is a shame because it would have been lovely to have her doing a few more. But again, she was in demand, and unfortunately is no longer with us. So
If she had done Pyramids of Mars, the book, I would listen to that every single night.
oh, bliss. So we have Planet of the Spiders. We have Now this is an interesting one. So coming up, you've got the Terrance Dicks novels from the Key to Time season that were rewritten by David Fisher later on. And one of the favourite readings of those is Stones of Blood with Susan Engel. which she does. Now, she's not quite the sit down, tell you a story. She's much more dramatic. She puts much more emphasis into it. And I think that really suits the Stones of Blood, which, again, like a couple of his other novelizations, actually in that version goes all over the place. Whereas I think the Terrence Dicks version of Stones of Blood is a lot more straightforward. So
Yes, I have listened. I will say that I listened to John Leeson reading the Androids of Tara audiobook, the David Fisher version, about a decade ago. I have not heard the Susan Engel performance of the David Fisher audiobook. So I haven't heard that one and I can't compare. I prefer Terrence Dicks's style to the version of Androids of Tara that I heard read out for the David Fisher book. My problem was not John Leeson's narration. My problem was David Fisher's style of humor is so Douglas Adamsy, and I've been burned out on Adams for a while now, that I just thought that Terrence Dicks giving us a straightforward adaptation of Androids of Tara was preferable to the what I thought was the belabored humor and parody of the David Fisher book. But I do not have the paperback copies yet. Those are coming out here in the States in the next few weeks. So I will have a chance to revisit that.
oh yeah, it'll be very interesting to compare that in that way and see if it's better for you or if you find the humor still doesn't work. And we had a lot of Douglas Adamsy people doing Douglas Adamsy kind of stuff over the last 10 years because obviously we've had the Cricket Men, City of Death, Sharda, Pirate Planet, and so on and so forth. So I can understand people getting burnt out on it a bit, particularly because when Douglas Adams does it, he does it perfectly. And again, it's about pitching it just right, which Douglas Adams usually does. And it's so easy to go one way or the other and get one word in the wrong place, and it doesn't work. It's very difficult to do.
And it's just
Um,
so many people are trying to do it. James Goss is terrific at it. Eric Sayward, who's also trying to do Douglas Adams, is less good at it. So when it just comes to the point where every Doctor Who book being written these days is trying to channel Douglas Adams. All respect to Douglas Adams, there are other ways to tell a story, and Doctor Who's genius is that it can tell multiple stories in multiple ways. It doesn't have to all be Douglas Adams. We do very well with variety.
yeah. I don't know what Eric Sayward was trying to channel with his two Dalek novels, though. Please tell me that the last two books, the last two podcasts you do in this range, you're going to find something to do after Revelation and Resurrection, something good to do after those two, or do you not have a plan yet?
I will be assuming that I get to them. I will be doing the more recent Target books in their own publication order.
Yeah.
So at this point, both Eric Sayward books are in the rearview mirror, and other books are coming out after them. Thank goodness.
Okay.
And we know that this year we have not just the David Fishers, but we also have the we also have the novelizations of Eaters of Light and Fires of Pompeii. And then next year we have the Zygon Invasion, plus whatever else comes out in 2023. So I can promise you that unless the mere act of talking of those books destroys my will to live and forces me to cancel the show, there will be other books after I get to Eric Sayward, I promise.
Good. I'm so glad to hear it. Yes. Right. Okay. I've got 3 more to go. We can do this. Okay. So one of the, I say unexpected, but the fact that he's a very good reader, it might be slightly unexpected. One of the brilliant joys is hearing John Coulshaw read these books. And if you want to hear somebody who is a master of their craft doing impersonations so well, impersonation after impersonation after impersonation, The Five Doctors is a tour de force. It is an incredible performance. Earlier today, I had some of my favourite bits from the audio novels on sort of random play. I was just picking out bits and saying, "Oh, listen to this, listen to that." And I was listening to the scene at the end of The Five Doctors where you've got Pertwee, Troughton, Herndl, and Davison confronting Barusa, played by
Philip Latham.
Philip Latham. Thank you. I'd have been there for half an hour. Sorry. And I listened to that bit. And I listened to John Coulshaw reading it, and yeah, none of his impersonations are 100% perfect, but they're so interesting and delightful and so 99.9% perfect. You can hear and feel Richard Herndl, Patrick Troughton, and all the others, and they're all so well observed. It's amazing. It's like it is audio theatre. The Five Doctors, one man audio theatre production, and yeah, it's one I can't recommend highly enough. A brilliant, brilliant reading.
Because it's not just the four doctors in that scene. You also have Barusa, who's the villain, and you also have Rassilon, and that actor gave a controversial performance that was re-recorded and re-edited for the special edition Five Doctors DVD. But in the same scene, you also have Nicholas Courtney, and you have Liz Sladen, and you have Janet Fielding, and you have Anthony Ainley doing the Anthony Ainley thing. And now I will help myself to immortality. So you have to do 12 performances in the same chapter. And if there's anybody else who could do that better than John Colshaw, I'd like to know about it because I don't think I could. I don't think it's possible.
Yeah, yeah, and you just listen because, like, obviously you get wrapped up in the story when you're listening to it, but if you listen to it carefully as you go through and you hear each of those voices come up, you just go tick, tick, tick. Yep, that's perfect. That's brilliant. Well done. Oh my god! Wow, just fantastic, fantastic.
I have a thesis, Steve. I have a thesis, and I don't know if you'll entertain it. I think that The Five Doctors is the best Doctor Who story of all time. If you take all, what is it, 250, 300 serials from Serial A all the way up through Legend of the Sea Devils, if you arrange them all in order of quality from worst to best, if you go from Time Lash to Caves of Androzani, if you go from Fear Her to Blink, if you go from Unearthly Child to Legend of the Sea Devils, I think Five Doctors is the best of them all. And I haven't fully formulated my thesis. It's a working thesis that I'll revisit when the book comes up. But I don't think you can do better. And there are some, amazing all timers. Midnight, Blink, Horror of Fang Rock, Caves of Androzani, Pyramids of Mars, all the great granddaddies. I'm not convinced that Five Doctors isn't the best of all of them. I'll leave that
I,
with you.
I will. Something to consider when you prepare your thesis. Maybe the Five Doctors is not the best Doctor Who story of all time, but maybe it's the most pleasurable. It's the most entertaining. It's the one that gives you the most joy every time you watch it. And then there's what criteria are you saying it's the best? Is it the best stats? It doesn't have the best special effects. It doesn't have the
Yes,
best this, that, or the other. But
I
yeah,
try. I try to look at Doctor Who on a continuum. Okay,
yeah,
you can't compare 1963 to 2022 in any sense except for words. So I'm looking at performances. I'm looking at dialogue. I'm looking at interesting plot twists. I am not considering special effects as part of that scenario. If you were to only consider the visual look of Doctor Who, then Chris Chibnall is the greatest era of all time. But of course, that isn't the case. So I'm looking at story quality. I'm setting aside sets, studio space, special effects. I think that Derek Martinez, I think that Michael Ferguson is just as good a director as Euros Lynn or Rachel Talale. They were just working with a very different palette and on a very different budget and under very, very different circumstances. I think you can compare 63 to the present, honestly. And I think you're right. Pleasurable is a really good part of it. For me, City of Death is the one story that I can watch over and over again and never ever get tired of. I think City of Death is perfect. But Five Doctors falls into the same category for me. There is not a moment in Five Doctors that I ever want to fast forward through. There's never a moment where I'm bored and I tune out. Um, I think Five Doctors has to have, maybe not the best in terms of quality. Maybe it's not as great a script as Caves of Androzani or Midnight or Turn Left. But I think just in terms of the pleasurability of the experience, yes, Five Doctors has to be up there.
yes. And with the audio reading, you've got a whole new way to enjoy the Five Doctors. You've got a whole new dimension of fun to enjoy with this story, and with these characters. I think it does bring something new, and it's very worthwhile. So yes, so the Five Doctors. So we've got two left. We've got. I'm going to go back to one I mentioned earlier, which is William Russell reading Doctor Who in an exciting adventure with the Daleks. Which again, watch it. only watch it in the winter month. Only listen to it in the winter months. Only listen to it when it's dark, preferably in November, preferably in London, and possibly in Barnes, because it is so rich in atmosphere. And I obviously I did the Daleks with Joe Ford on the Hamster with a Blunt Penknife. I think it's such an incredible story, and it's such a groundbreaking story that just like pushes not just Doctor Who, but television sci-fi further than it had ever been pushed before, and creates. There are other stories that done it, but not quite so well. It creates a whole genre. It creates a whole world, and William Russell's reading of it it's a blissful way to expand on what's there on the screen. You've got I love David Whitaker's novelization anyway, so there's that sort of element to it, and you just weave the two together, and you create something which is as enjoyable, if not more enjoyable, than what we got on TV. I think it's one of those ones where it's. I enjoy the TV version so much. I couldn't say which was better, but it's certainly it's another way to enjoy it, and it's wonderful for it.
This is the first interview that I'm recording for Doctor Who literature after the Pete McTighe slash Maureen O'Brien trailer for the season 2 collection box set came out. So that trailer came out about 3 days ago, and we are recording this shortly after that. We are recording this more than a week before the episode will go out to my audience. So that trailer is a little bit more in the past for you, the listener, than it is for Steve and myself. But one of the great things about that trailer was not just Maureen O'Brien, not just the way that Pete McTighe can tell a scene, but knowing that Matthew Sweet is sitting down with William Russell, who I believe is 117 years old, and William Russell is sharp as a tack and is funny in the clips that we saw of their interview. I am more excited for the season 2 Blu-ray than I am for. I'm more excited for that than I am for the Centenary. There, I said it. I am dreading the
Oh,
Centenary. It's 90 minutes. It could be the greatest episode of all time, but based on past returns from Chibnall, I think we're going to spend more time dissecting it and criticizing it and correcting it than we are enjoying it. I am not having any of those qualms for the season 2 box set. Okay, I think it's going to be the greatest week that I will ever spend with any Doctor Who media ever, and I'm very excited for it. It's a
yeah,
great set of stories. It's a great set of extras. I'll watch that trailer with Maureen O'Brien over and over again. So that is it. That is my thing. That is my jam. I am excited for it. And William Russell, who is still with us, and he goes right back to the beginning 60 years ago. He is on that Blu-ray, and he looks excited, and it's going to be fun. And I just don't know which special feature I'm going to turn to first. It's going to be an interesting choice.
yeah. The Matthew Sweet interviews have been phenomenal, and yeah, William Russell, he's got okay. So he did these 17 years ago. These readings, the three original ones. He also did Dalek Invasion of Earth, which is
Yes.
fantastic. Um, but he doesn't do. I think he doesn't do them so much now. Maybe he doesn't have the same energy levels. But I'm sure that for the interview, he will be on superb form. Matthew Sweet has a way of getting the most out of everyone he interviews, except Michael Grade for some reason. I thought that was a really bad interview. But
That
that's for
may
another
have to do
time.
more with the subject than with the interviewer.
I if Matthew Sweet had talked to him about his entire career, it could have been amazing. But just talking about Doctor Who, I think, was a missed opportunity. But there we go. There we go. So you're probably wondering what possibly the greatest, depending on what mood you're the greatest audio reading of a Target novel is, in my opinion.
It's going to be
And
hard for me to guess because I haven't heard them all. And you've already named all of my favorites. You've already mentioned Barry Letts. You've already mentioned Christopher H. Bidmead. You've already mentioned John Colshaw. You've already mentioned Caroline John and Liz Sladen. I'm trying to think what audiobook is out there that could be better than the 9 you've given me so far, and I am at a loss. So tell us. Tell
okay,
us.
okay, I'm just going to step back for a microsecond. Oh, Jason! Do you not realize what the greatest reading of all is? It is Stephen Thorne reading The Myth Makers. Oh,
Uh,
so
see,
I just thought I'd make that clear for you.
I mentioned Stephen Thorne earlier in this interview, and you didn't react. So you did a very good. You did a very good job of holding back.
Yeah, I'm so going to fail at 20 questions. It's going to be a disaster. Yeah. Oh, wow. I think The Mythmakers is a wonderful, oddball, brilliant novel that's masquerading as a Doctor Who novel. It's so different and fresh and witty and it's cutting and sarcasm, but it's still reverential to the characters. It still has a real heart to it. It still has it still has that genuineness, even if it's told from the point of view of somebody who's saying, "Oh, and then I ran to this camp, and it's all a bit silly, but hey, that's what I did anyway." And if you're reading a book about the Greek myths and all these great heroes and all these people who, in the context of the story, are better talkers than they are fighters, who better to read it than Mr. Loud himself, Stephen Thorne? It's just brilliant. It's slightly ear splitting. You could have had Brian Blessed doing maybe, but Stephen Thorne is definitely the right person for this book. He delivers it so well, and it is sheer joy for a Hartnell that gets overlooked and forgotten so many times. And also my favourite story, my story I most want back out of all of them, if it was ever returned. At least we've got Stephen Thorne reading the novelisation and making it a real fun, funny pleasure. So yeah, so that's my top novel reading.
And now it is time to challenge you with 20 questions. I have selected one Doctor Who serial at random from 1963 to the present. I know the answer. You do not. It could be any story. You have 20 yes or no questions. Question number 1.
Okay, is it new series or old series?
It has to be a yes or no question.
Is it a new series?
No. Question 2.
Okay, it is not a new series. Therefore, it is an old series. Is it in black and white?
No, it is not in black and white. Question 3.
Is it from the 1970s?
Yes, it is from the 1970s. Question 4.
Does it feature a returning monster?
No, it does not. It features a monster for the first and or only time. I won't say which. Question 5.
Thank you for the extra help. Okay, so now there must be a way to narrow this down very sensibly. Let me see. I'm going to go with. Oh no, I'll do the easy one. Is it a John Pertwee story?
Yes, it is. Question 6.
So it's a John Pertwee story with either a monster who's only in once or a monster who's making their first appearance.
And I want to point out to you, Stephen, you're at question 6. The
Yes.
all-time record holder on 20 questions on Doctor Who literature is Mr. Simon Hart, who got it in 7. You have one question to beat him if you want to take a random guess. You have 2 questions to tie him. Anything else puts you below Cy Hart on the Doctor Who literature totem pole. Not
Okay.
to put any pressure on you, my friend.
Okay, so we are looking at a. Okay, so it's very difficult. There is a story right in the middle there. It's calling out to me. It is the Claws of Axos.
Oh, you were very, very on point by trying to guess a random story. However, you have guessed the wrong story. It is not Claws of Axos. That brings us to question 7. To tie the all-time record, you have one shot.
Okay, I think I can get it in 20, so I am going to have another guess. And I am going to go for. I'm going to try my luck with the Curse of Peladon.
It is not Curse of Peladon. Question 8.
Okay, so we're back down to standard issue questions then. Right, so is the Master in it?
No. Question 9.
Is Liz Shaw in it?
No. No Master, no Liz Shaw. which makes it a sad story because those are two of my favorites, Delgado and Liz. Question 10.
Okay, so is oh hang on, hang on. What did I just ask Liz Shaw or Liz Sladen?
You asked Liz Shaw, as I
Sure,
understood it.
okay. Okay,
So
good.
that means it is not Series 7, and
It's
it is
not
not
Series 7.
Series 8, because it doesn't have Carol and John, and it doesn't have Roger Delgado.
Okay. Does it have Sarah Jane Smith in it?
No, it does not, and that means we are down to the back half. Now, many of my guests have been able to get it in less than 10. Many guests have gotten it in 11 through 20. Nobody has failed yet. But you are down to 10 questions remaining. Not to put any pressure on you, but you have 10 questions left before you are the first person to not guess the story.
That's fine, because at this point I think I can narrow it down nicely. Hang on, what was the answer to my master question?
It is a Roger Delgado free story.
Okay, that makes it incredibly easy then, because I can just go through them in order and say, is it the mutants?
No, it is not the mutants. Question 12.
Okay, is it? It can't be the Three Doctors, surely.
It is the Three Doctors, and don't call me
Yay!
Shirley.
Excellent.
Got it
I
in
survived.
12. That is a fair to middling performance, but you did not lose. You are considered a winner. So, Steve, thank you for winning Doctor Who literature.
Oh, I was
I
so
am
worried.
now going to reload the randomizer for my next victim for next week's story if they choose to play. And the randomizer is reloading. Oh, and I will say that the story for next week is it is one of Doctor Who's stories.
Yeah, go on, go on. Don't give them too much. Don't give too much away.
It is a Doctor Who episode between 1963 and 2022. And
Okay.
it was also referenced somewhere in the last 90 minutes, but since we talked about just about every Doctor Who story ever in the last 90 minutes, that is not really considered a clue.
Very good.
Steve, this has been the longest interview that I've ever done. We can
Oh,
easily go on for another 90 minutes, but I do have an audience to consider, and I try to keep these episodes below 4 hours in length. So, where else can we find you online, on Twitter, if you have your own podcast, anything else you wish to plug in the next 2 minutes?
okay. I would like to. So I've got my Instagram account, which is Steve Alexander Toys, where I used to take toy photographs. I am currently on hiatus, but hope to return at some point. I'm on Twitter at Steve Alexander UK, and again, Steve Alexander Toys. I will be starting a new exciting podcast soon, which is nothing to do with Doctor Who. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here because it won't be of interest to your listeners, possibly. And I am also. I've done a couple of hamster with a blunt penknives. I'm on a few trap ones with your good self, and I will appear on any podcast that will have me.
If you want to have Steve on your show, email me. Reach out to Steve at the places that are mentioned. He's a terrific guest. Very happy to have him on today. Longest interview ever. We will have you back. We will get you back on real soon. Steve, thanks again. Have a great night.
Thank you very much for listening to me for an hour and a half. It's been great. Thank you.
That was Vince. He said the boiler pressure has fallen and the siren will not sound.
Okay.
Get her out of here!
Like the others.
Yes.
Rigor mortis.
What is that?
He's been dead for hours.
But that is not possible. He was in his room.
Not Reuben.
But he was. I saw him.
The chameleon factor. Sometimes called lycanthropy. Leela, I've made a terrible mistake. I thought I'd lock the enemy out. Instead, I've locked it in. With us.
The voice pipe whistled and Leela went to answer it. She listened and then said urgently, "Doctor, Vince says the buoy pressure has fallen and the siren will not sound." "Harker," said the doctor. He set off at a run, and the others followed. They found Harker's body sprawled by the generator. The doctor knelt beside it, the others crowding into the room behind him. Adelaide caught sight of the body and started to scream again. "Get her out of here," said the doctor impatiently. Skinsale hurried her away. Leela looked at the body. "He is like the others?" The doctor nodded. He rose slowly, then looked at the door. Harker's wedges were still all in place. The doctor stood, thinking for a moment. He went over to the coal store, flung open the door and went inside. A moment later he emerged, dragging Reuben's body. He bent and tried to flex an arm. It was as stiff as an iron bar. "Rigor mortis. He's been dead for hours." "Hours, Doctor? That is impossible. Less than an hour ago Harker saw him go upstairs. I saw him standing in his room." "You saw something, Leela, but it wasn't Reuben. He was lying dead down here all the time." "But I saw him." The doctor's face was grim. "Shape changing, Leela. Sometimes called the chameleon factor. Several species have developed it, and our alien must belong to one of them." He looked at the door, still firmly barred by Harker's wedges. "I've made a terrible mistake, Leela. I thought I'd locked the enemy out. Instead, I've locked it in here. With us."
Doctor Who and the Horror of Fang Rock, written by Terrance Dicks, televised as Horror of Fang Rock, teleplay by Terrance Dicks, televised in September 1977, published in March 1978. On a remote rocky island, a few miles off the Channel coast, stands the Fang Rock Lighthouse. There have always been tales of the beast of Fang Rock, but when the TARDIS lands here with Leela and the Doctor, the force they must deal with is more sinister and deadly than the mythical beast of the past. It is the early 1900s. Electricity is just coming into common usage, and the formless, gelatinous mass from the future must use the lighthouse generators to recharge its system. Nothing can stop this Rutan scout in its search and its experimentation on humans. Somewhere on the internet is another review of the novelization of Horror of Fang Rock, not my own. I am not going to name the website where this review is posted, and I am not going to name the reviewer. The point of this exercise is not to name and shame somebody else's review. It's not a review you have to pay money to find, and it's not an odious right-wing screed bashing Doctor Who for, quote, going political, end quote, so I have no personal animus toward the author, and no motivation to tell you to not spend money on this reviewer's opinions. I only read the following excerpt, A, because I disagree with it on a fundamental level, and B, because if you've been listening to this show from the beginning, and if you're a new listener, welcome, I'm thrilled to have you. You know my thesis is that Terrance is often unfairly looked as a writer and craftsman because he was so prolific, and because this led to the easily reached but not easily defended position that he was sloppy, careless, or just not a good writer. Quote 1. For both Dicks and the novelization range as a whole, Doctor Who and the Horror of Fang Rock stands out as a worrying landmark, suggesting a decline in standards, and suggesting that the books can only go downhill from here. Quote 2. Doctor Who and the Horror of Fang Rock is a well-told book, but the huge print and blatant attempt to make the text run to 128 pages count severely against it, 4 out of 10. I respectfully dissent. Word for word, the Fang Rock book is Terrance Dicks at his most atmospheric, evocative, and empathetic. There may not be a whole lot of book here by word count, yes, that's true, though the page count is comparable to the novelization of The Face of Evil, and longer than the novelization of The Deadly Assassin, both books discussed here in recent weeks. But as we discussed last week with regard to Chris Boucher and his post-Face of Evil novels, sometimes a book can run twice as long but say half as much. My own position on the Fang Rock novelization is that every single word, sentence, paragraph, scene is a delight. Working from his own scripts and telling a story that he came to only reluctantly, Terrance proves that even a quickly written, micro-sized book adapting a last-minute replacement script can be a more enjoyable read than some of the 275-page full-size novels that he, or Boucher, wrote for Virgin Publishing and BBC Books in the 1990s and early 2000s. The production history of Fang Rock as a TV serial is instructive. Terrance was commissioned to write a vampire story, and a vampire story he submitted, but the BBC ordered that story to be shelved so as not to compete with a more prestigious vampire serial in production at the same time. So script editor Robert Holmes, with Dicks under contract and with a story slot still needing to be filled, had Terrance set a story in a lighthouse, a story Holmes wanted to see told, but which Terrance resented having to write. So, what does Terrance do? He tells a story in a lighthouse, and that story is Dracula. Dracula with Rutans. He calls his story Fang Rock, and the characters are stalked one by one, and one of those characters, in case you missed it, is named Harker. And the BBC never noticed that they were being trolled, and that the replacement script for Doctor Who Does Dracula was really Doctor Who Does Dracula with Rutans. How player is that? As for the text of the novelization, this is no mere transcript of the rehearsal scripts. It's March 1978, and it's Terrance's 11th novelization in 15 months. I am not making that up. Almost a dozen books in just over a year, and he had a full-time day job going at the same time. That's a breakneck pace, but our dude Terrance just crushes it with this one. There's nothing better, really, than Terrance Dicks' prose. I've said that before, and I'm saying it again here, and assuming this podcast, a book a week, runs about another 3 years, I'll be saying it a lot more. Terrance's prose is short and to the point, but employs good vocabulary, good use of adjectives and adverbs. There's no such thing as a Terrance Dicks run-on sentence, and as short as his books were by page count, he never talks down to the reader. He uses collegiate-level vocabulary, even while avoiding words of more than 3 or 4 syllables. And he can set a scene. The spooky prologue, setting Fang Rock's backstory, begins, Fang Rock had an evil reputation from its earliest days. The first chapter opens with, It began, with a light in the sky. Terrance started a lot of his novelizations with the word it, and he always tells you right where you are. I also like the retro you are there last couple of paragraphs of the prologue, and this makes it seem as if you are time traveling and actually living in the year 1900. Quote, Fang Rock has had an evil reputation from its earliest days. Soon after it was built, 2 men died in mysterious circumstances, and a third went mad with fear. There have been strange rumors, stories of a great glowing beast that comes out of the sea. But all that is forgotten now. It is the early 1900s, and the age of science is in full swing. Newly converted from oil to electricity, Fang Rock Lighthouse stands tall and strong, the great shining lantern warning ships away from the jagged reefs around the little island. As night falls one fine autumn evening, the lamp is burning steadily. The 3 men who make up the crew go peacefully about their duties, unaware of the night of horror that lies before them, little knowing that they would soon be caught up in a strange and terrible conflict with the fate of the earth itself as the final stake. Wow. Now, you can actually feel the chill December winds cutting through you as you're standing on the Flannan Isle rocks below the lighthouse. That is perhaps one of the most evocative passages in any Target book prologue, or perhaps any Target book full stop. I mean, you really feel the scene. You feel as if you're back in time. You can feel the chill wind, and you just know that something bad is about to happen. This is basically Terence writing a ghost story, in addition to Dracula. Fang Rock on TV is populated largely by one-dimensional characters, with the exception of Colonel Skinsale, who has 2 dimensions. But Terence is always able to characterize these people perfectly. Fang Rock was well acted on TV, but you don't need to mentally rely on the performances of, say, Colin Douglas or Ralph Watson or Sean Caffrey to get the picture. Ben, the senior lighthouse keeper, and the first to die, looks, quote, sardonically, end quote, at a shipmate. He and Reuben, the crusty old seaman, were, quote, continuing their never-ending argument, end quote, and Reuben, quote, always bellowed so loud he hardly needed the speaking tube, end quote. Lord Palmerdale has a spoiled, self-indulgent look about him, and you can imagine that description came directly from the rehearsal script and gave Sean Caffrey the perfect note to play Palmerdale. Louise Jameson is wonderful, isn't she? I've talked about that over the last few episodes, and Steve talked about it before the break, and you've heard a brief excerpt of Louise Jameson reading from the novelization herself. All of her novelizations came out within just a couple of years, so regrettably, I only have a few more months on this show to repeat how much I adore her acting performance. She was given what could have been a fairly thankless role, perhaps cast primarily to show off her legs on television, but she always found interesting ways to portray Leela's aggressive nature and intellectual curiosity. And the words Terence writes for her must have made it easy for Jameson to find those hooks, especially when performing this story. Here she observes the Doctor, quote, mentally rolling up his sleeves to solve a mystery, and her chant about Harker, keep the boiler pressure up, is exactly as scripted. The Target books in general tended to avoid giving much POV to the Doctor, preferring to show the world through the eyes of his companions, or those guest characters who entered his orbit. But when Terence does slip into the Doctor's head, it's a delight. The Doctor is able to figure out that something strange is going on between Palmerdale and the Colonel, a conflict that, by the way, ends up complicating the plot and dooming all the guest characters. More happily, the Doctor realizes that Reuben, quote, had only the vaguest idea how to work the telegraph, but was too obstinate to admit it. Isn't that wonderful? The word obstinate in a 120-page children's book? You could double the length of the book and be hard-pressed to find better words. Oh, and the foghorn sounds like, quote, the cry of a lovesick sea monster. Don't you just have the most intense crush on a writer whose mind can produce phrases like that? Now, because Terence is novelizing his scripts rather than the finished video, there are some differences in the book, and woe betide any director who crosses Terence Dix. Just listen to the audio commentary on the Fang Rock DVD to hear Terence take credit for what looks good, while blaming the production team for what doesn't. Here, the actual rescue of the shipwrecked survivors is shown. I imagine that was unfilmable on the budget allocated to Patty Russell at Pebble Mill, and the Part 2 cliffhanger doesn't end on a reaction shot of Adelaide, of all people. In the book, the Part 2 cliffhanger, the end of Chapter 6, ends more like this. The electric lights went out, and a terrifying scream came echoing up the stairs. And you can also see where the actors improve on the words that Terence gives them. Let's listen to a brief audio excerpt from Part 2.
Gentlemen, I've got news for you. This lighthouse is under attack, and by morning we might all be dead. Anyone interested?
Based on how those lines are adapted in the novelization, Terence scripted them slightly differently, a bit wordier, and the Doctor delivers them, quote, grimly. That's fine. But Tom Baker says it so much more simply, as you just heard, and does so genially and with a big smile. Terence is a genius, but so is Tom, and sometimes Tom just does it better. The rest of the TV serial is like that too, though with simplified dialogue. The book's Colonel Skinsale, Member of Parliament for Thurley, becomes Skinsale, the Member for Thurley, on TV. But you can have characters use more words in print without having it seem fake. Even though it's a short book, Terence works a character insight or observational humor, or even foreshadowing into almost every paragraph. This is no mere script-to-page transfer, which is a frequent but unfair criticism often leveled at Terence. In the book, Terence uses the aura of chill emanated by the Rutan to foreshadow disaster. We get internal emotion from Vince, the last lighthouse keeper to die, and arguably the most tragic character in the piece. Terrence also helps us understand why the Colonel risks and earns death by scrabbling for diamonds on the floor. There was a fortune there, the book tells us, enough to keep him in comfort for the rest of his life. He couldn't leave them. And the Doctor's dead with honor lie/eulogy to the Colonel is given more room to breathe. It was no way for a man to be remembered, Terrence adds. Chapter 12 was called The Last Battle. Last week, episode 39, about Doctor Who and the Face of Evil, I mused that Terrence chose that chapter title on purpose, as a conscious allusion to C.S. Lewis, and as a counterpoint to that story's militant atheism. But then he uses the same title for the second book in a row, 2 months apart, in a story that has no obvious religious subtext or axe to grind. Well, maybe an axe to grind against aristocrats, or to apologetic statesmen of a compromising kind. Or maybe the title was just lodged in Terrence's head from the previous book, and he unconsciously used it again. For a 120-page book, I dare you to write a better ending than Terrence's. Quote, "There was a wheezing, groaning noise, and the TARDIS vanished. The only sound was the thundering of the waves as they crashed on the jagged coastline of Fang Rock. No one was left alive to hear them." Next time on Doctor Who Literature, a book not by Terrance Dicks. We're going back in time, and we're going to be revisiting the era of the Second Doctor, which we have not seen in print for quite some time. By May 1978, we are getting another book from Jerry Davis, one of the best technical writers of the Target era, and it is the novelization of a story that was widely considered one of the greatest of all time until it was rediscovered. Join me and a new guest next week as we take a deep look at Doctor Who and the Tomb of the Cybermen. That's next time on Doctor Who Literature. Thank you for joining me on another episode of the Doctor Who Literature Podcast. I'm Jason, your host and editor and producer. Special thanks to my special guest, Steve Alexander. This podcast can be found on most of your podcast apps of choice. You can find all past episodes at anchor.fm/DoctorWhoLit. It really helps if you rate 5 stars and subscribe. You can find me on Twitter at Doctor Who Novels, that's DrWho Novels, and under the hashtag Doctor Who Pilgrimage, that's DrWho Pilgrimage, and on email at Doctor Who Literature, that's drwholiterature@gmail.com. Please drop me a line with your comments, questions, and suggestions. Thank you for listening, and whatever you do, keep turning the pages.